September 14, 1943. Stalag VII-A, Moosburg, Bavaria. The morning roll call began at 6 o'clock in darkness. 3,000 prisoners stood in rows across the compound while German guards counted them by torchlight. The count took 43 minutes. Every prisoner was required to remain standing at attention during the entire process. Captain Thomas Brennan stood in the third row from the fence, feeling September cold seep through the thin wool of his uniform jacket. He'd been captured 4 months earlier during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Shot down on his 19th bombing mission. The B-17 had taken flak over Palermo. 2 engines gone. The pilot ordered bailout at 8,000 feet. Brennan jumped. His parachute deployed. German troops captured him 20 minutes after he landed in an olive grove south of the city. The journey from Sicily to Bavaria had taken 3 weeks. Transport by truck then train. 60 men packed into each railway car. No food for the first 2 days. Water came from a single bucket passed through the cars once every 8 hours. The smell inside the cars was unbearable after the first day. By the time they reached Moosburg, 7 men in Brennan's car had died. The Germans threw their bodies from the train at a switching yard outside Munich. Stalag VII-A held prisoners from 17 different nations. British, American, French, Polish, Soviet, Yugoslav. The camp was divided into separate compounds by nationality. The American compound housed 847 men in 12 wooden barracks. Each barracks was designed for 60 prisoners but held 85. Men slept on wooden bunks in 3 tiers. No mattresses. A single blanket per man. The latrine was an open trench at the north end of each barracks. Food came twice daily. Morning ration at 7 o'clock. Evening ration at 1800 hours. The morning meal was ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and a slice of black bread. The evening meal was potato soup, occasionally with pieces of turnip or cabbage. The Red Cross packages arrived irregularly. When they came, prisoners received 1 package per week. The packages contained chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, powdered milk. Men traded items from the packages like currency. 2 cigarettes for a can of Spam. 1 chocolate bar for 3 cans of condensed milk. Brennan had been at Moosburg for 6 weeks. He'd learned the rhythm of camp life. The rules that kept you alive. Never volunteer for work details. Never talk back to guards. Never steal from other prisoners. Never give up hope but never expect liberation soon. The war news came from guards who spoke English, from new prisoners arriving, from German newspapers that sometimes made their way into the compound. The news was always weeks old by the time it reached the prisoners, but it provided fragments of understanding about what was happening beyond the wire. The guards at Stalag VII-A were mostly older men. Veterans from the First World War or men declared unfit for frontline service due to injuries. They carried rifles but rarely used them. The punishment for most infractions was solitary confinement in the cooler, a stone building at the camp center with individual cells. Men sent to the cooler received half rations and spent 23 hours per day locked in darkness. The longest sentence Brennan had heard of was 14 days. The man who received it had attempted escape through a tunnel the prisoners had been digging under the wire. The tunnel was discovered. The escape attempt failed. On this particular morning, September 14th, the guards conducting roll call were the usual rotation. Feldwebel Schmidt, a 52-year-old veteran who'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite at Verdun in 1916. Oberstfreiter Muller, a 48-year-old farmer from outside Hamburg who'd been drafted in 1941 despite a limp from a childhood accident. And a younger guard Brennan hadn't seen before. Maybe 24 years old. Clean uniform. Proper posture. The bearing of someone who'd completed military training recently and still believed in doing things correctly. The new guard walked down the third row, counting prisoners. His torch beam moved from face to face. When the light reached Brennan it stopped. The guard stared for 3 seconds. His expression changed. Recognition flickered across his features. Then confusion. Then something Brennan couldn't identify. The guard moved on without speaking. Continued counting the row. His voice was steady when he reported the count to Feldwebel Schmidt. But Brennan had seen the moment of recognition. Had seen it clearly. And in that instant, Brennan realized he knew the guard's face. Knew it from before the war. From another place. From a different life. The memory came slowly at first. Then with sudden clarity. Brennan was back in Philadelphia. Summer of 1938. He was 19 years old, working construction to save money for college. The job site was a new apartment building on Walnut Street in Center City. Brennan worked as a laborer, carrying materials, mixing concrete, helping the skilled tradesmen. The foreman was a German immigrant named Heinrich Schäfer. Tough but fair. Expected hard work but paid decent wages. Schäfer had a nephew who'd come to America from Germany that summer. The nephew was 17, spoke broken English, stayed with Schäfer's family while looking for work. His name was Klaus Schäfer. He'd shown up at the job site one morning in July. Schäfer got him a job as a laborer alongside Brennan. They worked together for 6 weeks until Klaus found better work at a warehouse in South Philadelphia. Brennan remembered Klaus clearly now. Quiet. Serious. Worked hard without complaint. Spoke little because his English was poor. But he'd been friendly in his way. He'd shared his lunch with Brennan on days when Brennan forgot to bring food. They'd gone to a Phillies game together one Sunday afternoon. Brennan had explained the rules of baseball. Klaus had bought them both hot dogs. In August 1938, Klaus announced he was returning to Germany. His father needed him. The family had a farm in Bavaria. His older brother had died in an accident. Klaus was needed to help run the farm. Brennan and Klaus shook hands on Klaus's last day at the construction site. Said they'd write letters. Neither of them did. 5 years later, Klaus Schäfer stood 20 feet from Brennan in the darkness at Stalag VII-A. Wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht. Carrying a rifle. Guarding American prisoners. The distance between Philadelphia and Moosburg felt infinite in that moment. The gulf between laborer and guard felt impossible to cross. The roll call ended at 6:43. Prisoners dismissed to their barracks. Brennan walked back to Barrack 7 without speaking. His mind was processing what he'd seen. What it meant. Whether Klaus had truly recognized him or if Brennan's memory was playing tricks after months of captivity. Inside the barracks, men began their morning routines. Some stayed in their bunks trying to sleep longer. Others gathered in small groups to talk or play cards or read whatever books existed in the camp library. Brennan sat on his bunk and stared at the wooden wall. He did not tell anyone what had happened at roll call. Did not mention recognition or Philadelphia or Klaus Schäfer. The knowledge felt private. Dangerous somehow. 3 days passed. Klaus worked the morning shift in the American compound. Brennan saw him every day during roll call and during the 2 daily ration distributions. Klaus never approached. Never spoke. But Brennan caught him looking twice. Brief glances that confirmed mutual recognition. They knew each other. Both remembered. Neither acknowledged it. The silence between them was a form of agreement. An understanding that some things couldn't be spoken in a prison camp. That the uniforms they wore created obligations neither could violate. Brennan was a prisoner. Klaus was a guard. Those roles defined every interaction. Personal history had no place in the equation. But knowing changed everything. Brennan began watching Klaus during the day. Observing how he performed his duties. Klaus was conscientious but not cruel. He enforced the rules but didn't add unnecessary harshness. When prisoners moved too slowly, Klaus shouted at them but didn't strike them. When men were sick and couldn't stand for roll call, Klaus reported them to the camp doctor rather than punishing them for absence. He was, Brennan realized, trying to do his job correctly without becoming the kind of guard prisoners feared. Other guards were different. Oberstfreiter Fischer hit prisoners with his rifle but for minor infractions. Feldwebel Braun withheld rations as punishment for talking during formations. Gefreiter Lang searched barracks roughly, destroying personal items and stealing from Red Cross packages. The prisoners hated these guards. Planned small acts of revenge. Stole tools from work details and blamed the guards for losing them. Reported false information to make the guards look incompetent to their superiors. But Klaus inspired no particular hatred. He was neither friend nor enemy. He was simply a guard doing his job. Most prisoners barely noticed him. Brennan noticed everything. He noticed that Klaus volunteered for evening shifts more than morning shifts. Evening shifts were less desirable among guards because they lasted longer and because evening roll call was more tedious when prisoners were exhausted from work details. Brennan wondered if Klaus requested evening shifts to avoid morning roll call. To avoid standing in the darkness watching men he might recognize. He noticed that Klaus never ate his lunch in view of prisoners. Other guards sat outside the barracks eating their bread and sausage where prisoners could smell the food. It was a small cruelty most guards engaged in without thinking. Klaus ate elsewhere. Out of sight. He noticed that when Klaus conducted barracks inspections, he moved through quickly and reported no violations even when minor infractions were visible. A hidden photograph. An extra blanket stolen from supply. Small contraband that other guards would confiscate and punish. Klaus pretended not to see these things. These observations told Brennan something important. Klaus remembered more than just Brennan's face. He remembered working beside him. Remembered Philadelphia. Remembered a time when neither wore a uniform. And that memory was making Klaus uncomfortable with his current role. The discomfort manifested as small acts of mercy that Klaus perhaps didn't even recognize as mercy. They were simply ways of maintaining distance between what he'd been and what he'd become. October arrived cold and wet. Rain fell for 9 consecutive days. The compound turned to mud. Prisoners tracked mud into barracks. Boots rotted from constant moisture. Respiratory infections spread through the camp. The infirmary filled with men coughing blood. The camp doctor, a Wehrmacht medical officer named Dr. Hartmann, moved among the sick with limited supplies. Sulfur powder. Aspirin. Blankets. Nothing more sophisticated. Men with pneumonia died because antibiotics were reserved for German troops. On October 7th, Klaus was assigned to guard a work detail outside the camp. 20 American prisoners selected to clear fallen trees from a logging road 15 kilometers east of Moosburg. The road was used by Wehrmacht transport trucks moving supplies toward the Eastern Front. A severe storm had brought down several large oaks. The road needed clearing immediately. Brennan was selected for the work detail. He'd been healthy enough to work and had experience with manual labor from his construction days. The detail assembled at the main gate at 7 o'clock. Klaus and two other guards, Oberstfreiter Muller and Gefreiter Lang, escorted the prisoners to a Wehrmacht truck parked outside the wire. The prisoners climbed into the truck bed. Guards sat in the cab. The truck drove east through Bavaria countryside. The drive took 50 minutes. The logging road was narrow, winding through dense forest. Pine and oak trees crowded both sides. The storm damage was extensive. 7 large trees had fallen across the road at various points. The truck stopped where the first tree blocked passage. The work was hard. Prisoners used axes and 2-man crosscut saws to cut through the fallen trunks. Each tree required multiple cuts to section into pieces small enough to roll off the road. Klaus supervised one crew of 10 men. Muller supervised the other 10. Lang stood guard, watching for any escape attempts, though escape in this terrain was nearly impossible. The forest was thick. The nearest town was kilometers away. Any man who ran would be caught or die of exposure. Brennan worked a crosscut saw with a British prisoner named Davies. They cut through a fallen oak trunk 60 centimeters in diameter. The saw blade caught on internal knots in the wood. Had to be backed out and restarted. The work was slow. After 30 minutes, Brennan's hands were blistered. His back ached from the bent posture required to operate the saw. Klaus walked over during a water break. He carried a canteen and offered it to Brennan. Brennan drank. The water was cold. Klaus watched him drink, then spoke in German accented English. His voice was quiet. Meant only for Brennan. You should wrap your hands. Blisters will get infected. Brennan looked at Klaus. This was the first time they'd spoken since Philadelphia. 5 years of silence. The words felt strange, formal. Neither man acknowledged what lay beneath them. I'll manage, Brennan said. Klaus nodded. Handed Brennan a strip of cloth from his pocket. Wrap them anyway. Infected hands mean you can't work. Can't work means reduced rations. Brennan took the cloth. Wrapped his palms where blisters were forming. Klaus watched, then walked away to check on the other prisoners and his crew. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. To anyone watching, it appeared routine. A guard showing minimal concern for a prisoner's ability to complete assigned work. Nothing more. But Brennan understood the gesture differently. Klaus had given him cloth that Klaus carried for his own use. Had offered practical advice without making it appear like help. The interaction was Klaus's way of acknowledging their shared past without speaking about it. Without violating the rules that govern guard-prisoner relationships. The work detail lasted until 1700 hours. All 7 fallen trees were cut and cleared from the road. The prisoners loaded back into the truck. The return journey to Stalag VII-A took 1 hour. By the time they arrived at the camp, it was dark. Prisoners were counted, inspected for escape attempts or contraband, then sent to their barracks. Evening rations had already been distributed. Each man received his portion cold. Brennan sat on his bunk eating potato soup that had congealed into a gray paste. His hands throbbed despite the cloth wrapping. He thought about Klaus. About the canteen offered. The cloth given. The advice spoken quietly. These were small things. Insignificant to anyone else. But they represented a kind of communication that couldn't occur openly in a prison camp. Klaus was trying to help without appearing to help. Was trying to maintain distance while acknowledging connection. Was trying to be a good guard by Wehrmacht standards while being something other than cruel by any standard. The position was impossible. The contradictions were unsolvable. Yet Klaus was attempting to navigate them anyway. Over the following weeks, Brennan noticed other small gestures. During a barracks inspection on October 12, Klaus found a hidden photograph under Brennan's mattress. The photograph showed Brennan's mother and younger sister standing outside their Philadelphia home. Possession of personal photographs was forbidden. Punishment was confiscation plus 3 days in the cooler on half rations. Klaus held the photograph for 5 seconds. Looked at the faces. Then slid it back under the mattress and continued his inspection. Reported no violations. Brennan watched this happen. Understood that Klaus was protecting him. Understood that such protection was risky for Klaus if discovered by other guards or camp administrators. On October 19, a Red Cross package arrived addressed to Brennan. The package had been damaged in transit. The cardboard box was torn open on one corner. 1 can of condensed milk was missing. Someone during the distribution chain had stolen it. Under camp rules, guards were required to report damaged packages and confiscate the contents to prevent smuggling. The contents would be redistributed to the general prisoner population rather than given to the intended recipient. Klaus handled Brennan's damaged package. He examined the torn corner. Then simply handed the package to Brennan without comment. Did not report the damage. Did not confiscate the contents. Brennan received his partial package. Lost 1 can of milk but kept everything else. Other prisoners in line behind him were less fortunate. Gefreiter Lang confiscated 2 damaged packages completely. The recipients received nothing. These incidents created a pattern. Klaus was quietly subverting rules whenever doing so wouldn't be immediately noticed. Was finding ways to reduce suffering without attracting attention. Was using his position to offer small mercies that carried significant weight for prisoners living on the edge of survival. But the mercies were dangerous. If other guards noticed Klaus's behavior, they would report him. Wehrmacht military law was strict. Guards who showed favoritism to prisoners faced court-martial. The penalties ranged from reassignment to the Eastern Front to imprisonment. Klaus was risking his own safety every time he bent a rule. Brennan realized he was Klaus's greatest risk. If anyone discovered their prior connection, Klaus would face immediate consequences. A guard couldn't show mercy to a friend without being accused of collaboration. The Wehrmacht feared guards who sympathized with prisoners. Feared the potential for betrayal. Feared that guards might help prisoners escape or sabotage camp operations. The knowledge of this risk created a new burden. Brennan felt responsible for Klaus's safety. Felt that their recognition at morning roll call had placed Klaus in danger. Every small mercy Klaus offered increased that danger. Yet Brennan couldn't tell Klaus to stop. Couldn't speak to him directly. The roles they played prevented honest conversation. So they continued their strange silent relationship. Klaus offered what help he could. Brennan accepted it without acknowledgement. Both men pretended the gestures meant nothing. Both knew otherwise. November brought the first snow. Temperature dropped below freezing. The barracks had no heat. Prisoners burned whatever wood they could find in small improvised stoves made from tin cans and scrap metal. The smoke from these stoves filled the barracks with eye-stinging haze. Men coughed constantly. The cold made everything harder. Standing for roll call required endurance. Working outside became torturous. Sleeping in unheated barracks meant waking with frost on blankets. On November 18th, a new prisoner arrived in Barrack 7. Second Lieutenant Raymond Cooper, shot down over Austria 5 weeks earlier. Cooper was 22 years old. Navigator on AB-24. He'd suffered a head injury when his aircraft exploded. The injury left him with severe headaches and occasional disorientation. He'd spent 3 weeks in a German hospital recovering from a skull fracture. Now he was considered healthy enough for prison camp. But Cooper wasn't healthy. Brennan saw this immediately. Cooper's hands shook. His eyes had trouble focusing. He got lost trying to find the latrine on his first night in the barracks. He couldn't remember which bunk was assigned to him. Other prisoners helped him navigate the confusion. Covered for him during roll call when he stood in the wrong row. Reminded him when to eat. Watched over him like injured family. On November 23rd, Cooper collapsed during morning roll call. Temperature was -8 degrees Celsius. Cooper had been standing at attention for 20 minutes when his legs buckled. He fell forward. Hit the frozen ground face first. Blood poured from his nose. He didn't try to get up. Lay motionless in the mud. Klaus was conducting roll call that morning. He saw Cooper fall. Saw the blood. He moved quickly. Called for the camp doctor. Ordered 2 prisoners to carry Cooper to the infirmary. Other guards would have simply ordered Cooper to stand back up. Would have counted him as absent if he couldn't comply. Would have reported him for malingering. But Klaus called for medical help immediately. Dr. Hartmann examined Cooper in the infirmary. Diagnosed a brain hemorrhage from the original head injury. The hemorrhage was getting worse. Cooper needed surgery. Needed a hospital with proper equipment and trained surgeons. But no such facilities existed at Stalag VII-A. The nearest German military hospital was in Munich, 60 kilometers away. Transport for prisoners was rare. Usually reserved for severely wounded men expected to die without intervention. Dr. Hartmann submitted a request for Cooper's transport to Munich. The request went through Wehrmacht bureaucracy. Camp commandant to regional Wehrmacht administration to hospital administration. The process normally took 2 to 3 weeks. Cooper didn't have 2 weeks. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. Klaus learned about this through conversations he overheard in the guard barracks. Guards talked openly about prisoner cases. Discussed who was dying and who might survive. Klaus heard about Cooper's hemorrhage. Heard about the transport request waiting for approval. Heard that Cooper would likely die before approval came. On November 26th, Klaus made a decision that went far beyond the small mercies he'd been offering. He approached Brennan during the evening ration distribution. Spoke quietly while handing Brennan his bowl of soup. The man who collapsed. He's dying. Brennan looked at Klaus. This was the first time Klaus had initiated conversation beyond practical instructions. The statement hung between them. Heavy with implication. I know, Brennan said. He needs to get to Munich. Needs surgery. The request is pending. Klaus nodded. It won't be approved in time. He paused. Then added, I'm going to Munich tomorrow. Personal leave. 1 day. I could arrange transport. Brennan understood what Klaus was suggesting. It was impossible. Also illegal. And incredibly dangerous. Guards didn't arrange unauthorized transport for prisoners. Doing so was court-martial material. Possible treason if framed correctly by superiors. You can't do that, Brennan said. I can sign requisition forms. Say transport is urgent medical necessity. If I submit the paperwork at the Munich hospital, they'll accept the prisoner. By the time anyone at the camp realizes I didn't have proper authorization, the surgery will be complete. You'll be court-martialed. Klaus looked at Brennan directly. Eye contact they'd avoided for 2 months. Maybe. Or maybe I'll simply be reprimanded for exceeding authority during a medical emergency. The Wehrmacht doesn't like losing prisoners to preventable causes. Makes camps look poorly managed. Why risk it? Klaus didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. Because I remember Philadelphia. Remember carrying bricks together. Remember you showed me baseball. Bought me a hot dog. He paused. I remember you treated me like a person when my English was bad and I didn't know how to be American. Now I'm supposed to watch your friends die because paperwork takes too long. This was the acknowledgement neither had spoken. The recognition made explicit. 5 years folded into a few sentences. Klaus was offering more than help for Cooper. He was offering an explanation for every small mercy since September. Was admitting that memory created obligation. That knowing someone before war made it impossible to treat them as the enemy during war. Brennan wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell Klaus not to risk himself. But Cooper was dying. Surgery might save him. Klaus was offering the only chance. What do you need from me? Brennan asked. Nothing. Just make sure he's ready to travel at 7 o'clock tomorrow. Tell him not to speak during the journey. I'll handle everything else. Klaus walked away before Brennan could respond. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes. But it changed the nature of their relationship. They were no longer guard and prisoner navigating impossible positions. They were 2 men trying to save a life. The war hadn't disappeared. The uniform still mattered. But the war had temporarily become secondary to something more fundamental. Brennan went to the infirmary after evening roll call. Found Cooper lying on a cot. Cooper's eyes were unfocused. He was barely conscious. Brennan explained that transport to Munich was arranged for tomorrow morning. Explained Cooper needed to be ready at 7 o'clock. Explained he shouldn't speak during the journey. Cooper nodded weakly. Didn't ask questions. Didn't have the energy. The next morning, Klaus arrived at Barracks 7 at 6:55 with a Wehrmacht ambulance requisition from the motor pool. He'd forged the paperwork. Made it look like Dr. Hartmann had authorized emergency transport. The forgery was good enough that the motor pool sergeant released the ambulance without questioning. Klaus drove himself. No other guards accompanied him. 2 orderlies from the infirmary loaded Cooper into the ambulance on a stretcher. Brennan watched from the barracks window as the ambulance drove out the main gate. Klaus at the wheel. Cooper unconscious in the back. The gate guards checked Klaus's paperwork. Waved him through. The ambulance disappeared down the road toward Munich. Klaus didn't return until late evening. When he did, he came directly to Barracks 7. Found Brennan. Spoke quietly. He's alive. Surgery went well. They removed a blood clot from his brain. He'll recover. Will you be punished? Klaus shrugged. Hospital administrator asked questions. I said Dr. Hartmann authorized transport verbally. Said I didn't realize written authorization was required. They accepted the explanation. I'll probably receive a written reprimand. Nothing serious. Thank you, Brennan said. Klaus looked at him. Don't thank me. We're not friends. We can't be. Not here. He paused. But we were friends once. In Philadelphia. Before this. That means something. Even now. He left without further conversation. Brennan stood in the barracks doorway watching Klaus walk across the compound toward the guard quarters. The snow was falling lightly. The camp was quiet. The moment felt significant in a way Brennan couldn't articulate. Something had shifted. The recognition at morning roll call in September had created connection. The subsequent small mercies had acknowledged that connection. But saving Cooper's life had transformed the connection into active resistance against the dehumanization the camp represented. Klaus had chosen to remember Philadelphia. Chosen to let that memory matter more than the uniform he wore. Chosen to risk punishment for a prisoner he barely knew because another prisoner he'd known years ago stood watching. The choice was subversive. Was dangerous. Was the only moral response Klaus could imagine to the impossibility of his position. Word spread through the barracks about Cooper's surgery. Prisoners knew Klaus had arranged the unauthorized transport. They didn't understand why Klaus had taken the risk. Guards didn't help prisoners without reason. Self-preservation always came first among guards. Yet Klaus had violated protocol to save one man's life. Some prisoners became suspicious. Maybe Klaus was trying to earn trust to identify escape plans. Maybe he was working with camp intelligence. Maybe the kindness was manipulation. Brennan heard these whispers. Heard men speculating about Klaus's motives. He wanted to defend Klaus. To explain Philadelphia. To tell them Klaus was helping because he remembered a different time. But explaining would expose Klaus to greater danger. Would force camp administrators to investigate their relationship. So Brennan stayed silent. Let prisoners think what they wanted. Klaus continued his duties without change. Conducted roll calls. Escorted work details. Performed inspections. Showed no particular interest in Brennan or any other prisoner. The surface remained professional. Only Brennan saw the careful distance Klaus maintained to avoid suspicion. But distance became harder to maintain as winter deepened. December brought severe cold. Temperature dropped to -15°C. The unheated barracks became dangerous. Men developed frostbite on fingers and toes. Dr. Hartmann amputated 3 frozen toes from a British prisoner who'd slept in wet socks. The infection spread. The prisoner died 4 days later. Sepsis. No antibiotics to prevent it. Food rations decreased. Wehrmacht supply lines were stressed by operations on the Eastern Front. Less food reached prison camps. Morning bread ration dropped from 200 grams to 150 grams per man. Evening soup portions became smaller. Red Cross packages stopped arriving. Allied bombing had disrupted rail lines across Germany. Packages sat in warehouses unable to reach camps. Prisoners began losing weight rapidly. Men who'd been thin became skeletal. Men who'd been strong became weak. Hunger changed behavior. Prisoners stole food from each other. Fights broke out over bread scraps. The solidarity that had existed earlier dissolved under the pressure of starvation. Trust disappeared. Every man watched his belongings constantly. Sleep was dangerous because sleeping men couldn't guard their possessions. The barracks became a place of constant suspicion. Klaus saw this deterioration. Watched prisoners become more desperate. He tried to help in small ways. Occasionally left half his lunch ration where prisoners on work details would find it. Reported smaller portions than he actually confiscated during inspections so prisoners could keep stolen food. Looked away when men scavenged in garbage piles behind the guard mess hall. But these gestures were drops in an ocean. They couldn't address the fundamental problem. Prisoners were starving. The camp administration wasn't going to increase rations. Red Cross packages weren't going to resume. The war was consuming everything. Prison camps existed at the bottom of supply priorities. On December 19, Klaus made another dangerous decision. He approached Brennan during evening roll call. Spoke very quietly while counting the formation. Barrack 7. Tonight. After lights out. I'll leave 2 loaves of bread and a package of cigarettes outside the south window. Don't let anyone see you retrieve them. Brennan stared at Klaus. This went beyond bending rules. This was outright theft from Wehrmacht supplies. If discovered, Klaus would face court-martial. Possible execution for collaboration with the enemy. The risk was enormous. You can't, Brennan said. It's done. The items are already set aside. Either you retrieve them or they'll be found in the morning and I'll be arrested anyway. Klaus moved on to count the next row. Left Brennan standing in formation processing what had been said. Klaus had already committed. Had stolen bread and cigarettes from Wehrmacht stores. Had placed them outside Barracks 7. The items would be discovered at morning inspection unless someone moved them during darkness. Brennan had no choice. Refusing to retrieve the items wouldn't protect Klaus. Would only waste the food and guarantee Klaus's punishment. At 2300 hours after lights out, Brennan left his bunk. The barracks was dark. Most men were asleep or pretending to be. He moved carefully to the south wall. The window there was boarded over to prevent heat loss. One board was loose. Brennan pulled it aside. Outside, in the snow, he found 2 loaves of Wehrmacht bread wrapped in cloth and a package of cigarettes. Standard Wehrmacht rations meant for guards. Now stolen for prisoners. Brennan retrieved the items. Replaced the board. Distributed the bread among 16 men in the barracks who were weakest. Gave the cigarettes to Davies, the British prisoner he'd worked with on the logging detail. Davies could trade cigarettes for extra food or medicine. The distribution was done silently. No one asked where the items came from. No one needed to ask. But the theft didn't go unnoticed. Oberstfreiter Fischer reported missing supplies from the guard mess the next morning. 2 loaves of bread and a carton of cigarettes. The camp commandant ordered an investigation. All guards were questioned. Their quarters were searched for stolen items. Nothing was found because Klaus had already moved the items out of the guard barracks before the investigation began. The investigation expanded. Camp administrators suspected prisoners might have bribed a guard. They began interrogations. Random prisoners were questioned about contact with guards. Whether they'd received extra food. Whether they'd traded contraband with Wehrmacht personnel. The interrogations were harsh. Men were threatened with the cooler. With reduced rations. With beatings. Brennan was questioned on December 21st. An SS officer had arrived from Munich to conduct the investigation. The officer was efficient and cruel. He knew prisoners had received the stolen items. He wanted to know which guard provided them. He wanted names. Confession. Evidence. Brennan said nothing. Claimed ignorance. The officer didn't believe him. Ordered Brennan to the cooler. 5 days on half rations. Solitary confinement in darkness. The punishment was meant to break him. To force confession. Klaus heard about Brennan's interrogation. Heard about the cooler sentence. He knew the investigation was getting close. Knew that if they pressured enough prisoners, someone would remember seeing Klaus near Barracks 7 that night. Someone would make the connection. Klaus would be arrested. Court-martialed. Probably executed. On the evening of December 22nd, Klaus did something that surprised everyone. He walked into the SS officer's temporary office in the camp administration building. Confessed to stealing the bread and cigarettes. Confessed to leaving them outside Barracks 7. Confessed to helping prisoners without authorization. The confession protected Brennan. If Klaus admitted guilt, there was no need to continue interrogating prisoners. No need to search for accomplices or witnesses. Klaus took full responsibility. Said he'd acted alone. Said no prisoner had asked him for help. Said his actions were his choice. The SS officer was satisfied. He had his confession. Had someone to punish. He arrested Klaus immediately. Removed him from guard duty. Placed him under Wehrmacht military custody pending court-martial. Klaus was gone from the camp by morning. Transferred to military prison in Munich to await trial. Brennan was released from the cooler on December 24th. He learned about Klaus's confession from other prisoners. Learned that Klaus was in prison. Learned that a court-martial was scheduled for January. The charges were serious. Collaboration with the enemy. Theft of military property. Endangering camp security. The penalty could be death. Brennan sat in Barracks 7 on Christmas Eve 1943 feeling the weight of Klaus's decision. Klaus had sacrificed himself. Had confessed to protect Brennan from further interrogation. Had accepted imprisonment and possible execution to prevent an SS officer from torturing prisoners for information they didn't have. The sacrifice was complete. Brennan could do nothing to help Klaus. Could not testify at the court-martial. Could not provide character witnesses. Could not explain Philadelphia or baseball or construction work in the summer of 1938. Those things existed outside the context of military law. Were irrelevant to Wehrmacht judges. Klaus would be judged solely on his actions as a guard. And those actions condemned him. Other guards at Stalag VII-A were nervous after Klaus's arrest. The incident made them aware that showing mercy had consequences. That helping prisoners could destroy their careers or end their lives. The guards became stricter. Stopped bending rules. Followed regulations precisely. The small mercies that some guards had offered disappeared. The camp became harder. Colder. More aligned with what it was designed to be, a place where men were held and forgotten. Brennan understood what had happened. Recognition at morning roll call in September had created connection. That connection had created obligation. That obligation had created mercy. And mercy in a prison camp was illegal. The system couldn't tolerate guards who remembered prisoners were human. Couldn't allow relationships that preceded the war to influence behavior during the war. Klaus had violated this fundamental rule. Had let memory matter. Had let past friendship create present action. And now he would pay. The price was his life. Or might be. The court-martial was scheduled for January 8, 1944. Brennan had no way to know the outcome. Had no way to contact Klaus or offer support. Could only wait and wonder whether Klaus would survive his choice. Christmas in Barracks 7 was quiet that year. No Red Cross packages. No special rations. Just the same thin soup and small bread portion. Men sang carols quietly. Shared memories of home. Tried to create normalcy in a place designed to eliminate it. Brennan participated in the singing. But his mind was in Munich. In a military prison. With Klaus Schäfer, a guard who'd remembered too much. January 1944 brought no news about Klaus's court-martial. Prisoners asked new guards about the outcome. No one would answer. Either they didn't know or weren't permitted to share information. The silence was heavy. Meant Klaus's case was serious. Meant the Wehrmacht didn't want details discussed publicly. A new guard replaced Klaus in the American compound. Gefreiter Hoffmann. Age 47. Veteran of Poland and France. Wounded in 1940. Reassigned to camp duty. Hoffmann was strict. Professional. Showed no mercy. Followed every regulation precisely. The kind of guard the Wehrmacht wanted. The kind Klaus had failed to be. Brennan watched Hoffmann conduct roll calls. Watched him enforce rules without bending. Watched him confiscate contraband and report violations and punish infractions exactly as prescribed by camp regulations. Hoffmann was everything Klaus had not been. And prisoners suffered for it. By late January, conditions in the camp had deteriorated further. Food rations dropped again. Morning bread ration was now 100 grams. Evening soup was mostly water with a few pieces of turnip. Men lost weight rapidly. Bodies stopped functioning correctly. Prisoners couldn't stand for long periods. Couldn't work effectively. Some collapsed during roll call. Others developed scurvy from complete lack of vitamins. Teeth loosened. Gums bled. Old wounds that should have healed reopened. Dr. Hartmann documented the decline. Submitted reports to Wehrmacht administration requesting increased rations or medical supplies. The reports were ignored. Prison camps were the lowest supply priority. Wehrmacht was focused on preventing Soviet advances on the Eastern Front. Had no resources for prisoners who tried to kill German soldiers. On February 3, Cooper returned to Stalag VII-A. He'd spent 10 weeks recovering in Munich hospital. His head injury had healed. The surgery Klaus arranged had saved his life. When Cooper entered Barrack 7, men barely recognized him. He'd gained weight during recovery. Had color in his face. Looked healthy compared to the skeletal prisoners around him. Cooper immediately noticed the change in the camp. Asked what had happened while he was gone. Prisoners explained. Told him about decreased rations. About Klaus's arrest. About the stricter enforcement under new guards. Cooper listened to the stories. Then asked specifically about Klaus. The guard who took me to Munich. What happened to him? Brennan explained everything. The confession. The court-martial. The silence since. Cooper processed this information. Then said quietly, "He saved my life. Knew he was risking everything. Did it anyway." "Yes," Brennan said. "Why?" Brennan considered the question. How to explain Philadelphia to Cooper. How to make someone understand that recognition changed everything. That knowing someone before war made it impossible to treat them as the enemy during war. The explanation felt inadequate even as Brennan searched for words. "We knew each other before," Brennan finally said. "Worked together in Philadelphia. 5 years ago. Different world." He remembered. Memory created obligation. Cooper nodded slowly. "And now he's in prison for acting on that obligation." "Yes." The conversation ended there. What more could be said? Klaus's sacrifice was complete. Cooper was alive because of it. But Klaus might die because of it. The mathematics were brutal. One life saved. One life destroyed. The equation didn't balance. Justice didn't exist in this context. February passed slowly. Prisoners continued dying from malnutrition and disease. The infirmary couldn't handle the volume of sick men. Bodies were stored in a shed behind the medical building waiting for burial. The frozen ground made digging graves difficult. Bodies accumulated. The Wehrmacht assigned prisoner details to dig mass graves when weather permitted. The graves held 15 to 20 bodies each. Brennan worked a grave digging detail on February 28. Temperature was -5°C. The ground was still frozen solid. Prisoners used pickaxes to break through the frozen surface layer. Then shovels to excavate deeper. The work took 6 hours. The grave was 3 meters long, 2 meters wide, 1.5 meters deep. 17 bodies were buried that day. British, American, Polish, Soviet. No separation by nationality. No individual markers. A single wooden cross at the head of the grave with the date carved into it. Nothing else. The Wehrmacht priest said a brief prayer. The guards shoveled dirt over the bodies. The detail returned to camp. Brennan thought about Klaus while digging. Wondered if Klaus was still alive. Wondered if Klaus understood the impact of his choices. Klaus had tried to maintain humanity in a place designed to eliminate it. Had tried to let memory matter in a system that required memory be forgotten. Had tried to save lives when saving lives violated military law. The attempt had destroyed him. But the attempt had also saved Cooper. Had provided bread to starving men. Had shown prisoners that mercy still existed even in prison camps. The impact was real. Tangible. Worth measuring. But the cost was also real. Klaus was imprisoned or executed. Either way, removed from his life. His family in Bavaria probably didn't know what happened. Probably received a form letter from Wehrmacht administration. Soldier Klaus Schäfer court-martialed for violations of military law. Dishonorably discharged. Status pending. Nothing more specific. Brennan imagined Klaus's father reading that letter. Reading it at the farm where Klaus had returned in 1938 to help after his brother's death. Trying to understand what Klaus had done. Why he'd violated military law. What could have been so important that Klaus would risk his career and life? The father would never understand. Couldn't understand. Because the explanation required knowing about Philadelphia. About construction work and baseball games and hot dogs and 2 young men working side by side in summer heat. Required knowing that Klaus had been treated with kindness by an American when Klaus was 17 and struggling to navigate a foreign country. Required understanding that Klaus had remembered that kindness for 5 years. Had let it matter enough to risk everything. April 29, 1945. American forces liberated Stalag VII-A. The 14th Armored Division rolled through the main gate at 14:30. Prisoners saw American tanks approaching across the compound. Men who could walk rushed toward the wire. Some prisoners collapsed from excitement and weakness. Others wept. The liberation was real. Survival was certain. The war was ending. Brennan stood near Barracks 7 watching American soldiers move through the camp. They looked shocked by what they found. 3,000 severely malnourished prisoners. Bodies stacked in the medical shed. Mass graves in the field beyond the wire. Living conditions worse than anything they'd encountered during the advance through Germany. The liberating soldiers provided immediate medical care, set up field hospitals, distributed rations carefully to prevent refeeding syndrome, arranged transport to hospitals for severely ill prisoners. The work took days. American medical personnel moved among prisoners taking names, documenting condition, providing treatment. On the third day after liberation, while recovering in a temporary hospital tent, Brennan asked an American officer about Wehrmacht personnel captured when the camp was liberated. The officer said most guards had fled before American forces arrived. The ones who remained were taken to POW holding areas for processing. "I'm looking for someone," Brennan said. Wehrmacht guard named Klaus Schäfer. He was transferred to Munich for court-martial in December 1943 / "I need to know what happened to him." The officer made notes. Said he'd check records. Said it might take time. The Wehrmacht kept detailed documentation, but accessing it during wartime chaos was difficult. 2 weeks passed. Brennan was transported to a hospital in England for treatment and debriefing. His weight had dropped from 175 pounds to 118 pounds during captivity. He needed dental work for scurvy damage. Needed antibiotics for a respiratory infection. Needed weeks of proper nutrition to rebuild strength. While recovering, Brennan wrote letters to Army intelligence requesting information about Klaus Schäfer. Described the situation. Explained Klaus's arrest. Requested information about the court-martial outcome. The responses were slow. Army intelligence had millions of records to process. Individual inquiries were low priority. In June 1945, Brennan received a letter from a Captain Morris in Army intelligence. The letter contained information found in Wehrmacht records captured in Munich. Klaus Schäfer's court-martial had occurred on January 8, 1944 as scheduled. The charges were collaboration with the enemy, theft of military property, and endangering camp security. The verdict was guilty on all charges. The sentence was 10 years military imprisonment. Klaus had been sent to Wehrmacht military prison in Brandenburg. He'd served 15 months there. In April 1945, as Soviet forces approached Brandenburg, all prisoners were evacuated. Klaus was transferred to a holding facility in western Germany. The holding facility was liberated by British forces on May 5, 1945. Klaus Schäfer was alive. Had survived imprisonment. Was being held in British POW camps awaiting repatriation. Brennan read this information with relief. Klaus had survived his choice. 10 years had been reduced to 15 months by Germany's defeat. Klaus would return to Bavaria. To his family. To whatever life existed in post-war Germany. Brennan wanted to contact Klaus. Wanted to thank him. Wanted to explain that Cooper survived and that the bread fed starving men and that Klaus's choices mattered. But contacting Klaus was impossible. The British POW system didn't allow correspondence between former prisoners and German POWs. The rules were strict. No personal contact. So Brennan returned to Philadelphia without speaking to Klaus. Returned to civilian life. Got a job in construction again. Different company. Same work. Resumed the life interrupted by war. His mother and sister welcomed him home. Neighbors organized a celebration. Everyone wanted to hear stories about the war. About liberation. About survival. Brennan told some stories. Edited others. Never mentioned Klaus Schäfer. Never explained the recognition at morning roll call. Never described the small mercies or the stolen bread or the confession that saved him from torture. Those things felt too personal. Too complicated. Too difficult to explain to people who hadn't lived in a prison camp. Who hadn't understood what recognition meant in that context. In 1947, Brennan tried again to contact Klaus. The war had been over for 2 years. POWs were being repatriated. Brennan wrote to the Red Cross asking for help locating Klaus Schäfer. Provided information about Klaus's family farm in Bavaria. Asked if letters could be forwarded. The Red Cross responded 6 months later. Said Klaus Schäfer had been repatriated to Germany in September 1946. Had returned to his family farm outside Moosburg. The Red Cross could forward a letter if Brennan wished. Brennan wrote the letter immediately. Mailed it through Red Cross channels. The letter explained everything. Philadelphia. Construction work. Recognition at roll call. Cooper's surgery. The stolen bread. Klaus's confession and arrest. Brennan thanked Klaus. Said Klaus's choices saved lives. Said the mercy mattered. Said Brennan had never forgotten. Would never forget. The letter was 5 pages long. Written in English because Brennan's German was limited to basic phrases. The Red Cross promised to translate it before forwarding. Klaus never responded. Brennan waited 6 months. Then a year. Then 2 years. No reply came. Maybe the letter never reached Klaus. Maybe it reached him but Klaus chose not to respond. Maybe Klaus wanted to forget Stalag VII-A and everything associated with it. Maybe reconnecting with a former prisoner was too painful. Too complicated. Too much a reminder of choices that destroyed Klaus's military career and imprisoned him for 15 months. Brennan didn't know. Couldn't know. Could only accept the silence as Klaus's answer. They'd known each other for 6 weeks in Philadelphia in 1938. Had recognized each other in a prison camp in 1943. Had navigated impossible positions for 4 months. Then separated by war's end and post-war chaos. The connection was real. Had mattered. Had saved lives. But it couldn't survive transition back to peace. In 1963, Brennan traveled to Germany on business. His construction company was involved in rebuilding projects. Brennan visited Munich to inspect potential work sites. While there he drove to Moosburg, to Stalag VII-A. The camp was still standing. Some barracks had been demolished. Others remained as storage buildings. The wire was gone. The guard towers were empty. The place was abandoned but recognizable. Brennan walked through the compound. Stood where Barrack 7 had been. Looked across the field where roll call occurred every morning. Imagined Klaus counting prisoners in darkness. Imagined the moment of recognition. September 14, 1943. The torch beam on his face. Klaus's expression changing. Two worlds colliding. From the camp, Brennan drove south. Found Schäfer's farm outside Moosburg. The address from Red Cross records. A small property. Fields planted with wheat. A modest farmhouse. Barn and equipment sheds. Brennan parked on the road. Sat in his car watching the farm. He saw an older man working in the field. Could have been Klaus's father. Brennan didn't approach. Didn't knock on the door. Didn't ask about Klaus. The visit felt like an intrusion. Klaus had chosen silence. Brennan needed to respect that choice. But from the car, Brennan could see the farm was functioning. Was productive. Someone was maintaining it. Maybe Klaus. Maybe Klaus's father. Maybe both. The site provided some closure. Klaus had returned to Bavaria. Had returned to farming. Had rebuilt a life after imprisonment. The specifics didn't matter. Survival mattered. Continuation mattered. Brennan drove back to Munich without speaking to anyone at the farm. The visit was enough. Seeing the place Klaus returned to. Knowing Klaus had a life after the war. That the choices Klaus made in the camp hadn't destroyed him completely. The imprisonment had ended. The court-martial was history. Klaus had survived. Brennan never returned to Moosburg. Never attempted contact again. The silence between them became permanent. They'd saved each other in different ways. Klaus had saved Brennan from interrogation and torture by confessing. Had saved Cooper's life with unauthorized transport. Had saved other prisoners with stolen bread and bent rules. Brennan had saved Klaus by never revealing their prior connection during interrogations. By protecting Klaus's identity even when threatened with punishment. The mutual protection created a bond neither could articulate. Neither needed to. The war had placed them in impossible positions. They'd navigated those positions as well as possible. The navigation had cost Klaus 15 months of imprisonment. Had cost Brennan 2 years of starvation in a camp. But both had survived. Both had returned to some version of normal life. The rest was silence. Sometimes silence is the only honest response to events too complex for words. Thomas Brennan died in 1998 at age 74. Heart attack. Quick. He was retired. Living in Philadelphia. Close to where he'd grown up. Close to where he'd worked construction in 1938 with a German immigrant's nephew who spoke broken English and didn't understand baseball. His daughter found papers in his desk after he died. Letters from the war years. Documents from Army intelligence. Photographs from Stalag VII-A taken by American soldiers during liberation. And a 5-page letter written in 1947. Never sent. Addressed to Klaus Schäfer. Different from the letter Brennan mailed through the Red Cross. More personal. More raw. The unsent letter explained what recognition meant. How seeing Klaus at morning roll call changed everything. How memory created obligation. How Klaus's small mercies accumulated into something larger than individual gestures. How Klaus's confession saved Brennan from torture. How Klaus's choices demonstrated that humanity persisted even in places designed to eliminate humanity. The letter also explained Brennan's silence after 1947. Said he'd stopped trying to contact Klaus because silence seemed like what Klaus wanted. Said he understood Klaus might need to forget. Might need to leave Stalag VII-A in the past. Might need to avoid reminders of choices that cost him 15 months of freedom. The letter was an apology for writing at all. For trying to reconnect. For refusing to let memory fade. Brennan's daughter read the unsent letter. Read all the documents. Tried to understand her father's war experience. She'd known he'd been a POW. Known he'd been at Stalag VII-A. But he'd rarely discussed details. Had told stories about liberation and American soldiers bringing food. Had mentioned prisoners dying from malnutrition. But never mentioned Klaus. Never explained recognition. Never described the moral complexity of guards who remembered prisoners were human. In 2003, Brennan's daughter traveled to Germany. Found Moosburg. Asked at the town records office about the Schäfer family. Learned that the farm still existed. That Klaus Schäfer had died in 1996. That his sons maintained the farm. That Klaus had lived quietly after the war. Had rarely spoken about his military service. Had worked as a farmer until his 70s. Had been respected in the community. She visited the farm. Met Klaus's younger son Martin. Explained who her father was. Showed him the unsent letter. Translated sections into German. Martin read the letter carefully. Then invited her inside. Showed her a wooden box Klaus had kept in his bedroom. The box contained Klaus's military documents, court-martial papers, discharge notice, and a 5-page letter written in English, translated into German, dated 1947, from Thomas Brennan. Klaus had received Brennan's letter, had kept it for 49 years, had never responded but had never destroyed it. The letter had mattered enough to preserve. Martin explained that Klaus didn't talk about Stalag VII-A. The court-martial had brought shame to the family. The Wehrmacht conviction meant Klaus returned to Bavaria as a dishonored soldier. The community knew he'd been imprisoned. Knew he'd collaborated with enemy prisoners. Klaus had lived with that stigma for 50 years. Had worked hard to rebuild his reputation. Speaking about the war meant explaining the collaboration. Explaining meant acknowledging the conviction. Klaus chose silence instead. But Klaus had kept Brennan's letter. Had kept his court-martial documents. Had kept everything related to those 4 months in 1943. The preservation suggested the events mattered to Klaus. That memory hadn't faded. That Klaus remembered Philadelphia. Remembered construction work. Remembered roll call on September 14th. Remembered choosing mercy over regulations. Martin gave Brennan's daughter copies of the documents Klaus had preserved, including a photograph Martin had never seen before. The photograph showed 2 young men standing outside a construction site, both wearing work clothes, both smiling. One was clearly Klaus. The other was Thomas Brennan. Someone had taken the photograph in Philadelphia in summer 1938. Klaus had kept it for 58 years. The photograph explained everything. 2 young men before war. Before uniforms. Before prison camps. Before choices that cost one man 15 months in prison and the other man 2 years as a prisoner. The photograph showed who they'd been when recognition meant nothing. When knowing each other was simple. When friendship didn't require risk. The war had destroyed that simplicity. Had placed them on opposite sides. Had made friendship impossible. But memory had persisted. Had created obligation. Had forced Klaus to choose between military duty and human decency. Klaus chose decency. The choice cost him. But the choice also saved lives. Created mercy where regulations demanded cruelty. Demonstrated that humanity could survive even in places designed to eliminate it. Recognition meant Klaus couldn't forget Philadelphia. Couldn't forget Thomas Brennan. Couldn't treat prisoners as the enemy when one prisoner had been his friend. The recognition was Klaus's burden. But also Klaus's redemption. Because remembering meant Klaus remained human in a place that tried to make everyone inhuman. And 49 years after the war, Klaus's son held a photograph proving that recognition had been real. That memory had mattered. That 2 young men had once worked side by side carrying bricks under Philadelphia's summer sun. The photograph was evidence. Was proof. Was the answer to why Klaus risked everything. Because some things can't be forgotten. Even when war demands forgetting. Even when forgetting would be safer. Some things persist. Names. Faces. Moments when another person treated you with simple human kindness. Those memories create obligations. And sometimes honoring those obligations requires sacrificing everything else. Klaus Schäfer honored his obligations. Thomas Brennan honored his. Neither man spoke about it afterward. Neither needed to. The photograph said everything necessary. 2 young men. Before war. Before the moment when recognition changed everything. That moment, September 14, 1943, morning roll call at Stalag VII-A. Lasted 3 seconds. The torch beam on Brennan's face. Klaus's expression changing. Recognition flickering across his features. 3 seconds. Barely noticeable to anyone watching. But those 3 seconds created ripples that spread across 2 lives. Across 50 years. Across an ocean. Across the impossible distance between prisoner and guard. Enemy and friend. Memory and forgetting. The moment mattered. Not because it was dramatic. But because it was human. 2 men remembering who they'd been before uniforms defined them. The memory didn't stop the war. Didn't change the camp. Didn't save everyone. But it saved some. Cooper lived. Starving men received bread. Brennan escaped torture. Klaus's conscience survived 15 months in prison. Small things. Insufficient things. But real things. Sometimes recognition is enough. Sometimes remembering is the only resistance possible. Sometimes choosing to remain human in inhuman circumstances is the entire point. Klaus Schäfer understood this. Thomas Brennan understood this. And understanding changed everything.